the hand of the Home Secretary at the time, a man called Alan Johnson, famous for being a postman, very knowledgeable about drug policy, and maybe he delivered some, I don't know. Anyway, he's trying to shut me up because I was saying that cannabis wasn't really as dangerous as people make out. But the key point about this particular image are the scales of justice here, because what I was actually saying was, look, beer and fags are the problem in Britain. They're still the biggest killers by far. And the hysteria that was the Brownite government and the Blair government before it, and subsequently the Cameron coalition government, the focus on these drugs, new psychoactive substances, MPS, is, in my view then and still is, it was largely a smokescreen to appease both the drinks industry and also the right-wing press. It's something that was happening. But it turns out it's actually been very destructive, not just in terms of policy and the harms from drugs, but also in terms of research. Anyway, I was arguing we needed a new policy. The policy didn't make sense, and that cannabis was less harmful than alcohol. That got me sacked. But fairly soon after, I discovered I had a supporter, this man, Obama, President Obama, and this is a remarkable statement if you want to go and read about it. At that time in America, I think about 6 or 7 states had medical cannabis. It was still illegal then, as it is now. It's still illegal under federal law. You can still you have a minimum 7 years prison sentence if you're caught smoking on federal land. So any of you going to the States in the summer, just make sure you know where you are if you're going to do anything like that. But it was legal as a medicine in California. And the Drug Enforcement Agency, the feds, they were breaking down pharmacies on the grounds that they were in breach of federal law. And Obama said, look, this is ridiculous. The states have a right to decide what their medicines are, and we should not impose our laws against recreational use on those states. So he said, basically, we're not going to prosecute medical cannabis use in California. And he said also cannabis was less harmful than alcohol. And that was a justification for being more rational. And that's the first time an American president has ever told the truth about drugs. And it changed the whole tenor of the American debate. So now, I think it's, 22 states have recreational cannabis. And about 31 have medical cannabis. And it won't be difficult for you to work out which ones haven't. And they're very much the states in the middle and the south that voted for Trump. So liberal American states have mostly all now got recreational cannabis. And the world hasn't ended, but of course we haven't even in Britain even begun to move towards legalizing recreational cannabis. And we do have medical cannabis, but as Hannah will talk about later, that's just almost a gesture. It's hardly had any impact yet on medical practice. So how do we know this? Well, how do we know? Well, we know it now, and we're pretty confident we know that cannabis is less harmful than alcohol for a whole series of pieces of research that drug science have done. So what is drug science? Drug science is a charity that I set up when I was sacked. It was set up with funding by a guy who, nuclear physicist actually, who made his money using the same algorithms for looking at nuclear breakdown, applying them to the financial sector. He made a lot of money, and he gave drug science the money to set up to do the various things that we do, and that was Toby Jackson. We were also supported by a charity that's been around for a very long time called the Centre for Crime and Justice Studies, and they set us up and we started going, and we've done a lot of things in the 10 years. We've gone from being essentially a kind of one-man or I suppose initially it was kind of half a day a week from me band to a large organisation. I think we have 10 employees now. And we've done a whole series of interesting things, and I want to just share some of them with you at present. So this is the website, and it's a really useful website. Some of you probably have gone onto it. It's got a vast amount of information. You can find information about drugs, about drug policy, about our research, about other people's research. You can find slide sets. We've got a phenomenal slide set, hundreds of slides, which have been put together by our student members with oversight by our experts, which are freely downloadable. If you want slides on anything relating to medical cannabis or psychedelics or MDMA, there's phenomenal slide sets. You don't need to make your own. You can just go and take them and download them. And I recommend you follow it. It's got a Twitter feed, and if you follow drug science, probably about once a week, something interesting will come up that you will want to know about. Probably the most famous thing we've done is do the multi-criteria assessment of drug harms, the MCDA. And this was something that actually I was starting to do when I was working for the government. In fact, this oversight, this analysis of the ways in which drugs cause harm, these 16 ways drugs cause harm, actually came out of a conference. It was funded by the Home Office and the MRC. And a group of experts worked out what all the harms of drugs could be, whether there are harms to the user on the left here, the harms to society on the right. And having worked out what they were, we then defined them, came up with ways of clearly assessing comparative harms on these 16 different parameters of harms. And then after I was sacked, Drug Science convened a decision conference to assess the comparative harms of these 20 drugs. And some of them are legal, some are illegal, some are medicine, some are not. And what we did was get together for a couple of days and rank each of those drugs on each of those 16 parameters of harm using a ratio scale. So the most harmful drug is as 100, and then something half as harmful as 50, and something a hundredth as harmful as 1. And because they're ratio scales, we can then compare them, even though they're in very different dimensions of harm. You can pull the scales together and come up with a final ranking. And then we did weightings, because obviously not each of those parameters, not each of them have the same importance, at least certainly they didn't to our expert group. And then it goes into a computer program called HighView, and out of it comes this graph, which is now a kind of meme, isn't it? It's been shown many, many thousands of times. This is my most cited paper. There's Larry Phillips, the guy who told us about MCDA and led the program, and still working hard in his voluntary role for drug science. And what this shows is comparative harms of the 20 different drugs, with alcohol being the most harmful. Now, the blue bar is the harm to the user, the comparative harm to the user. So if the bar is twice as big, it's twice as harmful. And the red bar is harm to society. And you see alcohol is the most harmful drug overall because the red bar is so huge. And you might want to contrast it with crystal meth here. Crystal meth is more harmful to the user. The blue bar is bigger, but there's not a lot of crystal meth use in Britain. So overall, alcohol is the most harmful drug. So that confirmed a study that I had published in The Lancet in 2007 when I was a government's advisor, which actually said that alcohol was more harmful than people supposed. Now, alcohol became the most harmful drug. And that's what I was arguing about. If you care about drug harms, then you'd do something about the most harmful drug, wouldn't you? I mean, kind of makes sense. But the government wasn't really interested in that because the alcohol lobby is so powerful and because so many people drink, and a lot of us enjoy drinking. So they didn't want to contaminate the pleasures of alcohol with a sensible discussion about the harms. But what also came out of that was the fact that there is no relationship whatsoever between whether a drug is classified as A, B, or C in the Misuse of Drugs Act, or whether it's unclassified. You say there's no relationship at all. This is alcohol up here, and there's heroin, cocaine, and things like magic mushrooms down here. So there's no relationship. There's zero relationship. Now, that is very worrying, because the Misuse of Drugs Act and the other international equivalents, like the UN Conventions, are supposed to be based on harm. And that is that's rather chilling, and that's something that we've been exercised by ever since. I actually think the drug laws are illegal because they don't comply with the original law. The statute that set up the Misuse of Drugs Act said it should be evidence-based. They're certainly immoral because they're putting people in prison. In some countries, the UN Conventions allowing execution of people who are using drugs less harmful than drugs like alcohol. And why do we have this situation? Well, that's a whole other talk, but it's all about politics. But in terms of thinking about what we're talking about today, it really is, can we do better? Can we not have a Misuse of Drugs Act that actually does what it's supposed to do, which is reduce harms? That paper, it's been massively cited, and it caused quite a lot of interest in all around the world where people were assessing the harms of drugs. And we got a grant from the European Commission. The Department of Justice in Europe said, well, would you redo it in Europe, but using European experts? So we did. We redid it, 30 European experts, 20 European different countries, reviewed the same 20 drugs. They changed every rating. They changed every weighting. And the final results were almost identical. There's only one drug changed place, and that was GHB. And the correlation between the UK experts and the European experts was 0.995. I mean, which is unheard of in this kind of, what you might call sort of social pharmacology, social science kind of approach. So it's clearly a very robust way of assessing harms. And alcohol was still top in Europe. And a couple of years ago, we read it in Australia. And that turned out to be very interesting, because it shows not only the power of this approach, but also how it is sensitive to altered drug use. So here you see alcohol is still number one drug of harm in Australia. But you'll see here that crystal meth has come from being much lower, fifth, I think, in Britain, to second in Australia. And that's because they have a lot more use of it. So it's kind of validated the approach that we've taken, this MCDA approach. And we've used it now to compare the harms of different forms of opiates. We've recently published a paper showing you can use it to look at the value of different forms of treatment for chronic pain, in which medical cannabis came out top. And you can use it for other things. And one of the most provocative one was when we started using it a long time ago, to assess the comparative harms of different nicotine products. Is Sue Wanacott in the audience? No. She's still here. Hmm? She's retired. Yeah. Well, so have I, but I'm here. She's 12 years. Right. Sue Wanacott was a great Bath expert on nicotine, and maybe I've got in the way there. Maybe I should go back a slide. So, as you know, there are very many different ways of taking nicotine, and they range from tobacco, smoking tobacco here, to taking nicotine lozenges here. So these are medicines. These three forms of nicotine delivery are medicines. And you can see they score very low in terms of harm, which is kind of reassuring, because you'd hope that medicines would actually be pretty low in harm. And here you see that tobacco, smoking cigarettes in particular, is the most harmful form of taking nicotine. And in here you have e-cigarettes. And e-cigarettes come out much, much lower, between about a 25th and a 40th the harm of smoking cigarettes. So this is the first paper that's actually tried to make a sensible comparison of vaping and tobacco smoking, especially cigarette smoking. And you might be interested to think, what is this huge red bar for tobacco, for cigarettes? Why are cigarettes so harmful? And it turns out that half of all the fires in the world are caused by cigarette stubs. 2,500 people a year burn to death through people throwing cigarette stubs out. A lot of them kill themselves. They fall asleep in bed. So it's not just passive smoking. It's an amazing statistic. And that's one of the things about doing MCDAs. When you get an expert group together, you actually learn things. In fact, now I feel uncomfortable about having an opinion on anything until I've done an MCDA. But it showed e-cigarettes were relatively much less harmful. And that was one of the Public Health England used that data to argue that we should have a rational policy and we should encourage e-cigarette use to reduce cigarette use. And we are about the only country in the world that's done that. So we actually lead the world in terms of harm reduction using e-cigarettes. New Zealand has recently brought in a new tobacco policy which also emphasizes this kind of research. Okay, so that's a bit of the background of what drug science has done in terms of assessing comparative harms of drugs. What has our government done? Well, our government has done a load of things which have been pretty damn useless, really. And they've done it in the face of knowledge that we've offered them, although I have to say they've never consulted us once. Though occasionally we do write to the ACMD and we say to them, you might have got this wrong, you might have got that wrong, but then a civil servant writes back and says it's none of your business. And what is all this? Why are we doing all this? Well, of course, there's this famous, wonderful quote from Einstein. Insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. And actually, I can tell you, I have heard, it must be 10 Home Secretaries spouse the same platitudes as the current one. It's almost like they go into the Home Office and above their desk it's drugs are harmful, our policies are working. Blah, blah, bollocks. Yeah. I've shown you that. Sorry. But one of the things they don't understand, or they don't seem to care about, is it's not just that the drug policies don't work to do what they want them to do, which is to reduce the harms of drugs. Although I have to say, just as an aside, it was only very recently that British drug policy in the last 30 years has actually talked about harms. The whole of policy development in the Home Office has been around use. They believe, and the police have encouraged this belief, that prohibition of drugs will reduce use, and prohibition, of course, funds policing and customs and that. So they've argued, it's been a sort of job creation for the prohibitionists. It's only literally in the last drug policy review that harm have actually come to at least been accepted alongside of use as a major outcome variable. And our policies up to now have singularly failed to deal with harms. But there's also been this collateral damage, and this is the thing that is really most sad in a way, because the drugs that have been banned and often vilified are drugs which do have a lot of utility. And here's just some examples. There's loads of value in medical cannabis. You'll hear about it more in a minute. Ecstasy is a powerful treatment for PTSD. It has value in Parkinson's disease, tremors, and dyskinesia. Psilocybin, I'll show you a bit about that in a minute. But we've shown it's an enormously powerful treatment for depression. We're doing studies in pain syndromes and OCT. Lsd was before it was banned, and now still potentially a very helpful drug to help people come to terms with dying. And mephedrone, which I'll talk about at the end, which is a legal stimulant for about 18 months, it's actually being developed as a treatment for addiction, but it got banned. And once a drug gets banned, it's almost never possible to resurrect that or to work with it in a way which makes it economically valuable. So companies won't work with illegal drugs. And you think of a drug like buprenorphine, which is now the absolute mainstay of opiate therapy, the partial agonist buprenorphine. And we have in the audience one of the men that made it, Steve Husbands, or at least made better ones. And buprenorphine was not developed by the company that made it. Reckitt and Coleman refused to develop buprenorphine as a treatment for opiate addiction when I was working for them. And why? Because opiate addicts are bad people, and we don't want to be associated with bad people. It was developed as a painkiller, an analgesic in low doses. It was obviously a wonderful potential treatment for opiate addiction. And it was only when Reckitt and Coleman were going bankrupt that the US government funded all the trials of buprenorphine for addiction. And that's the problem. Companies won't work in the field, and so the opportunities are enormously reduced, which is very unfortunate. And it is extraordinarily difficult to research these drugs. I'll just explain a little bit how challenging it has been to work with things like psychedelics. So the worst successes of both the UK and particularly the international conventions are these. So more people in the world are denied access to morphine as an analgesic than are allowed access. That's the populations of China, India, Indonesia, and Malaya. Why is that? Because it's easier for those governments to comply with the UN conventions by not allowing the drug in the country than pay for safekeeping requirements, which involve things like safes in pharmacies. In most countries, cannabis is not available for pain and spasticity. Now, the UK has changed that notionally, but in reality, hardly anyone gets access. There's no country in the world that has licensed psychedelics as a medicine. They are available legally as truffles, mushroom truffles in the Netherlands, and now one American state, Oregon, and a couple of towns have decriminalized them. There's no country in the world where MDMA is legal. And when you work with research with these scheduled drugs, it's very, very, very difficult. And this is a truly horrific graph, because this looks at the impact of the UN conventions on research with psychedelics. So the blue bars are the number of papers per year for LSD, and the red bars for psilocybin. Psilocybin is a magic mushroom juice. Psilocybin was a medicine from about 58 to about 67. Here. You can see a massive increase. LSD Research, US government funded 140 separate trials on LSD. Because in those days, in the 50s and early 60s, we didn't really have any other psychiatric medicines. It was a breakthrough. Massive, massive interest. And then, because of the Vietnam War and the Nixon's war on drugs, it got banned. And then you see publications virtually disappear. There were 2 years when there were no publications on psilocybin. And that was a stated ambition by National Institute of Drug Abuse in America. They wanted people to never remember that LSD had ever been made. They thought they could eliminate it from international consciousness. And luckily, they're not, because we're fighting back. But this massive, that is censorship of the worst sort. It's not, but you talk to regulators, say, no, we didn't ban research. What they did do, they never funded any, and say it's 90% of all research on drugs is funded by the US government, didn't get funded. But on top of that, the regulations meant even if you got funding from a philanthropy or a charity, you could never get the drug. No one has ever succeeded in getting LSD for human work in America in the last 50-odd years. They just started getting psilocybin. So it was de facto censorship. If you're interested in it, I've written a couple of papers highlighting it. And it wasn't just psychedelics. The same is true for medical cannabis. The massive explosion of medical cannabis in the States is still not being researched. You might have 31 states allowing it as a medicine, but the federal government only this year is beginning to accept they should research that, because they still believe by saying it's illegal, they'll stop people using it medically and recreationally. So, and there's also, I talk about ketamine as well, which was somewhat censored. So if you want to read, these are two articles to read. In my view, this censorship is the worst censorship of research in the history of science. I can't think of a better example. Now, when I give talks to Americans, they say, whoa, what about the Bush ban on embryonic stem cell research? And I say, oh, we loved that, because all your top scientists came to Britain. And the Americans think, oh, really, didn't know that. But that was just America. But, whereas the ban on research has extended around the whole world, over 200 countries still endorse. The international ban on cannabis still exists. Even though the WHO have conceded it's a medicine, the United Nations haven't ratified that yet. And it is the worst censorship of research. I can only think of one example that had a kind of global, sort of semi-global reach, and that was when the Catholic Church banned the writings of Copernicus in, since 1616. And that was for the same reasons as we banned drug it was banned because it conflicted with the moral and the political, religious theories at the time, which was that the Earth was the center of the universe, and which, of course, it isn't. But that only applied in Catholic countries, and the Northern European Protestants could carry on looking at the skies and writing about the planetary motions with impunity. And to be honest, there weren't that many astronomers. But in the 50 years since we've had these UN conventions pretty much banning everything, hundreds of thousands of psychiatrists and neuroscientists could have used these drugs, but they've been denied access. And most of them actually don't even know what they're missing, because they've actually never been taught that the ban is destructive. So why are these drugs banned? Well, they're banned largely because there were four factors driving prohibition. And they came together in an extremely effective sort of clamp. There's the temperance movements, the 20th century temperance movements. I don't know if any of you ever listened to the In Our Time, the Melvin Bragg show on the radio. Well, you should listen to last week's episode, which was on the temperance movements. And it's remarkable. There was a time in Britain in the 1840s, you could not get insurance, health insurance, if you did not drink. Alcohol was seen as a necessary part of life. And in fact, what the temperance movement was started in part by someone who wanted to give non-drinkers the right to health insurance. It's fascinating how the world has changed. So the temperance movement wanted to get rid of all drugs, and obviously it succeeded quite well in getting rid of alcohol in the 1920s in America. But by that point, by 1920s, the temperance movement had eliminated a lot of weak combinations or weak productions, formulations of things like cannabis, cocaine, morphine, which were being bought in pharmacies for people to deal with pain, etc. Commercial interest. The pharma industry has definitely had some influence here. The model particularly the German model of you find a natural product, you find salicylic acid in willow bark, you stick a couple of acetyl groups on it, and then you patent it as a product that you can then sell. That's been hugely influential because, of course, it happened with morphine. And it didn't happen with the cannabinoids, which they weren't so they didn't care too much about cannabinoids. But when when you could get an extract of a pure product and commercialize it, there was enormous incentive then to stop the use of the herbal products. So the pharmaceutical industry is very influential in trying to reduce access to other sources. And then, of course, political expediency. And almost all the drug laws that have been made since, whatever, it was the 1910 Hague Convention, have been made for political reasons. Partly the Brits, we wanted to control the markets for opium, and particularly the Dutch to some extent, and then subsequently the Americans. And, of course, the big problem that we are now left with, the legacy problem, is the war on drugs, the American war on drugs, which is completely politically driven. It was an initiative to get Nixon elected. And this is his advisors. This is the Dominic Cummings of Mr. Nixon. And somewhat slightly more effective, I guess, but maybe, I don't know. Our campaign, basically he was saying, look, our campaign to get Nixon out of the problem. He supported the Vietnam War. It was going badly. The Americans wanted the Vietnam War stopped. Nixon didn't want to stop it. So he distracted attention, in the same way as Boris distracted attention from all the economic problems over Brexit. He distracted attention to drugs. And they started this attack on hippies for using marijuana and blacks for using heroin. And he said, we attacked them day after day after day after day. And we created this fear of drugs. And it was so successful that he won every state except Maine. And he got elected. But, as Ehrlichman said afterwards, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And pretty much every drugs minister in Britain since that point has admitted when they've stepped down from office that they have got it wrong about drugs. But when they're in office, they won't do anything because the right-wing press and particularly the Tory party are so keen on punishing people. And lies are a problem. Here are a couple of great quotes about lies. Charles Darwin, false facts are very injurious to science, for they endure long. And this is the more psychologically aware one by Mark Twain, how easy it is to make people believe a lie, and how hard to undo that. And yes, that's why we try not to lie in science, because it's difficult to undo. I just want to say a few words about cannabis, why people were so angry about me saying that cannabis was less harmful than alcohol, because cannabis to me part of the Labour Party's campaign to show that they had a tough policy. They could compete with Cameron's Tories on drugs. And this is me being sacked. There's me in the spiff. These are the other scientists on the ACMD who resigned when I was sacked. Cannabis was hardly a problem in Britain in 1971 when the Misuse of Drugs Act came in. About 500,000 users. A lot of them were Afro-Caribbeans who'd come over to run our public services. And you can see the banning of cannabis as a medicine, which happened in 1971, and due to pressure from the US, had absolutely zero impact, as far as we can see, on the use of cannabis. A 20-fold increase in the 40 years, probably 100-fold or more increase in consumption. And so the idea that stopping it as a medicine would actually have any impact on recreation was completely bonkers. And we only did it because the Americans had done it in 1934. And they insisted that we followed it. But you should know that almost every single drug law in Britain, apart from our own Psychoactive Substances Act, where we've exceeded even the American stupidity, would be made at the behest of the Americans. So cannabis is illegal, doesn't kill anyone. Here are the deaths. Alcohol, 80,000 deaths a year. Alcohol, 20 to 30,000. Opiates now going up and up. They're more than this. Is an old slide, I apologize. And cannabis, does cannabis kill anyone every year? Maybe, probably not. To justify keeping cannabis illegal, we've had to develop all sorts of intellectual contortions, like saying cannabis causes schizophrenia, which it doesn't. But it certainly, if our policy to contain cannabis by prohibition has just led to the production of much stronger versions of cannabis, and also now synthetic cannabinoids like spice, which have actually created the problem of psychosis. We didn't have it before, but by banning herbal cannabis from places like Morocco and Lebanon, we've effectively created a problem with cannabis. So that's an example of how our laws have actually become self-fulfilling in a way. Well, we've been fighting back. So since there are pharmacists here, the Pharmaceutical Journal, we had a nice debate a few years back in their annual conference, which voted in favor of liberalizing certainly medical cannabis, which was pleasing. And one of the reasons, and this is something Hannah will talk about in 2021, one of the exciting possibilities is that medical cannabis will reduce the use of opioids. We're seeing that in some US states now. And we saw that in our MCDA of medical cannabis. Patients prefer medical cannabis to opiates. MDMA is going to be a medicine. Just last year, a major phase 3 study was published by MAPS showing it's twice as effective as placebo in terms of treating PTSD. Ben Sessa, I think, is going to come and lecture to psychology departments soon about this as well, so you'll hear more about that then. And you might wonder why PTSD. Well, PTSD actually has become the disorder of our time. Here are a couple of images of places where PTSD, so that you have this remarkable impact of the Middle East wars, both on soldiers and on the non-military, the civilians. And when you get to a situation where more soldiers kill themselves than are killed by the enemy, you kind of know you're in a sort of turning point, of war. What is the point in pursuing a war if you can't win it, and B, your soldiers are killing themselves, and they're killing themselves because they don't understand why the hell they're at war in the first place, and they're getting traumatized by seeing their partners killed and and being blown up or having percussion injuries, etc. And this is a remarkable study that was done 10 years ago now by the Mithofer, showing MDMA therapy as part of psychotherapy for PTSD produces phenomenally big and enduring outcomes. These people have failed on other treatments, and now they're well, and some of them stayed well for the 10 years after the treatment. But no one had ever studied what MDMA does in the brain. Why? Because it's illegal. You couldn't get funding in America, and we couldn't get funding in Britain to do the necessary studies. Why is MDMA useful for PTSD? And in the end, we got money from Channel 4 to do this, and it was an interesting saga. They approached me to do a study of people taking cocaine live on TV. And I said, well, we could do that, but A, we've already done it, and B, it's not very interesting. And they said, no. They came back a month later and said, well, what Class A drug would you do live on TV? I said, there you go. Right question. And we said, MDMA. Why MDMA? Because no one's ever done brain imaging. So the deal was, we brain image people under MDMA, and some of them would come and talk on TV. And it was a wonderful study to do. I don't know if you know the novelist Lionel Shriver. She was one of our volunteers. Yeah. And she was great. She came out of the scan. She said, Nutt. She said, that's rubbish. Give me more next time. What we did in the scanner was we asked people to remember. We didn't know these memories. I don't know what they were, but we asked them to get 6 good and 6 bad memories, and then remember 3 good ones and 3 bad ones in each of the placebo and MDMA conditions. And we discovered, as we might have predicted, that MDMA increases the valence, the positive valence of good memories, but also, as we wondered, reduced the valence of bad memories. And we were able to show the impact of MDMA using this fMRI technology was profound. MDMA dampens down activity in the hippocampus and amygdala, the stress circuits of the brain. And that's why it works in PTSD. People can engage in the therapy because their emotions are not overwhelmed. PTSD is a disorder where you talk about the trauma, the so-called declarative memory of the trauma, and the emotions come back as if you're in the trauma. And that's really unsettling, and it's so overwhelming for many people. They can't actually engage in the therapy, where MDMA will dampen down that emotional response so people can take part in the therapy. And now, it's very likely it'll be a medicine in a couple of years. And then there's the mushroom, psilocybin. And psilocybin is an active ingredient in over 200 species of magic mushrooms. It's a serotonin 2A receptor agonist. And we did the first imaging studies with this. It started off using it intravenously because it's so expensive to get these controlled drugs that we couldn't afford to give it orally. So we give it intravenously. It produces the same kind of trip, but a shorter trip than taking it orally. And the effect was dramatic because we genuinely it's not expected that all psilocybin would be to dampen down brain activity. we assumed that all the visuals and the strange experiences of body dissolving and floating out into space would be associated with some increase in brain activity. It's not. All it does is dampen down a key circuit in the brain, which is called the default mode network. And but it also dampened down this part of the brain, the default mode, which is the anterior subgenual cingulate cortex, which is a driver of depression. So we thought, well, if that region drives depression, we can switch it off with psilocybin. Maybe we could do a study in depression. And in 2012, we got the only grant we've ever gotten from the government to work in this field. It was treated to see if psilocybin would help people resistant depression. And it took a year to get ethical permission. They said it was too dangerous. They said we couldn't do a study. We had to do a safety study. You've got to give it to 12 people, and if they don't die in 6 months, then you can go back and do a controlled trial. And ethics committees have such power, we had to agree. So the psychological measures, the psychiatric measures are secondary. The main outcome was life or death. You won't be surprised they all lived. But that was actually kind of easier than getting the drug. Only one place in the world will make human quality psilocybin because it's a controlled drug. You've got to have a license. Most countries won't give licenses at all. So we have to find a country that will give a license, get it made, get it imported, exported from there, imported here. 30 months to get hold of this drug because it's so dangerous. Another 2 months to get the MHRA to approve, but I'd warmed them up before then, so they were ready. So it cost 32 months out of a 36-month grant to actually get the drug because it's such a dangerous thing. I had to have a special safe put into my office, or the office next door to mine, to keep my psilocybin. And I said, well, why can't I put it next to the heroin and the fentanyl in my other safe? They're not Schedule 1 drugs. Oh, no. Psilocybin's really dangerous. On what grounds? Well, it's a UN convention, Schedule 1 drug. But why? That's the rule. That's the law, Gov. I mean, absurd. And it costs £1,500 a dose to comply with all that crap. Anyway, we did the study. And the effect was remarkable. A single 25 milligram dose produced a profound improvement in mood. In these people, they'd all failed on at least 2 antidepressants. Many had failed on 10. They'd all failed on CBT. And they all got better. And some are still better now. Some are better 8 years on. Most aren't. Most have relapsed. And the problem is the ones who got better and relapsed are desperate to have it again. But because it's an illegal drug, I can't give it to them again. Unless I'm doing a trial of people who failed on psilocybin. So, we're a horribly circular argument. But this did provoke a company called Compass Pathways to kick off. And now there has been a similar trial to this, a dose-finding trial. It's not yet published, but it shows the same effect. This is the biggest impact of a single treatment in resistant depression ever. And, there's also an interest now in looking back at the past, looking back at the history of these drugs and discovering actually that some of the research done in the 50s and 60s of psychedelics was hugely powerful. So this is a study looking at the use of LSD, 6 trials of LSD, 1 or 2 doses in the 1950s and 60s for alcoholism, meta-analysed recently by these 2 Norwegians, an effect size twice as big as any treatment we have today. But for 50 years, we've not been able to use this because it's too dangerous. And you think, so let's probably in the 50 years since it was banned, probably 100 million people, but between about, say 2 million people a year on average, now it's 3.5, die of alcohol, die prematurely from alcohol. So let's say 100 million deaths, premature deaths. And maybe if LSD worked in 10%, it'd probably do better, but say it works in 10%. Well, that's 10 million deaths prevented, right? Now, how many lives have been saved by the banning of LSD? I would say probably none, but let's say it did deter some people. Maybe it's 100. Maybe it's 1,000. Maybe it's 1,000,000, but it's still the equation in favor of therapy, is so balanced. So the drug laws, are just completely irrational when you begin to look at value rather than simply the principle of stopping. And things are beginning to move now. A couple of trials of psilocybin, one for tobacco smoking, one for stopping alcohol use, and neither have just 2 months ago funded the first ever trial with a psychedelic that they funded in the last 50 years, and that's to pursue the tobacco cessation. Because the impact on cigarette smoking is to about 80%, between 70 and 80% of the people never smoke again, which is way more powerful than any other treatment solution. Ketamine is now licensed as a medicine, and MDMA I've talked about. And I just want to finish by just saying a few things about, where's the hysteria? One of the arguments is that medical use would encourage recreational use. Drug ministers, until recently, were saying this. We can't have medical cannabis because it'll encourage recreational use. And I say, well, we have the highest recreational use of cannabis in the world. Oh, they say. So how's it going to get? We're saturated, and they're being poisoned by stuff that is like skunk. So, it's absurd. But, the argument's a fallacious argument, but they use it. The idea that people are going to displace from medical use to recreational use, the costs of medical use are high, and there's very little evidence of that even for more interesting drugs like opiate. And it gives the wrong message. And this is the whole point. The drug laws are based on messaging, and moral messaging. And there's a wonderful quote here. The messaging only matters if you're waging a war on drugs. And this is a great. This quote says, "When at war, all reason is treason." And this quote really struck with me because one of my mates sent it to me after I was sacked. He said, "David, you should have read this. You should know, if they're waging a war, you cannot reason with them." And that's the problem. The war on drugs essentially has taken reason out of the debate. And it's still doing that. We still do not have snus and nicotine replacement therapy, which is probably even less harmful than vaping in Britain. Because, I don't know why. Probably because the tobacco industry doesn't want it. We could replace alcohol. I'm working on that now. I'm working on alcohol alternatives. We just launched a botanical one called Sentia, which is actually, beginning to get a discussion going. But we could do much better. We could make synthetic alternatives. We're trying to do that. But no one knows whether they're legal or not. Under the Psychoactive Substances Act, they might be illegal, they might not be. And that's quite unsettling to investors. When you say, give us £20 million to do this, they say, well, will it get banned? And you say, well, probably not, but we can't be sure. And they say, maybe I'll go make some bombs. Bombs will never be banned. And I just want to point out that safer drugs are so important. This is one of the great natural experiments there's ever been in terms of drug harms. And it shows what happened when mephedrone came to Britain in, this was 2008. So mephedrone is a synthetic cathinone. It's a dopamine releaser. It's like it's sort of halfway between speed and MDMA, more speedy than MDMA. And so what you see here are deaths per million people of cocaine and amphetamine sulfate here. And mephedrone comes along, and suddenly cocaine deaths fall by 50%, and amphetamine deaths fall by about a third. Why? Because people substitute. Because it's legal, so they're not going to get arrested or prosecuted for using it. And you can just ring up and buy it from your corner shop. They'll deliver within a half an hour. Wow, this is the biggest impact on cocaine death there's ever been. It's an absolute revolution. No drug policy, no drug would ever do that, has ever done that. But because of the 2010 election, because Labour wanted to be hard on drugs, so they ban it, mephedrone gets banned. And you see, well, if everything's illegal, cocaine's a better drug. No question about that. So cocaine deaths are going up and up. We're reaching year on year all-time highs with cocaine deaths and amphetamine deaths. Methadone deaths have disappeared, you'd be pleased to know. Actually, they weren't hardly any in the first place. But so people, the hatred of young people, particularly using a drug which is legal other than alcohol, drives so much of that policy. So I'm going to finish now. I've rabbited on perhaps too long, but I just want to... This should be the underpinning principle of public life, I think. In a freedom-loving society, no conduct by rational adults should be made criminal unless it's harmful to others. And unfortunately, that isn't how our drug laws are produced by the people who run our public life. So I'll finish. I'll just point out, if you want to read more about this, you can read my book about drugs. You can read my book about the brain. You can read the book about me. And you can read the one that's just come out this week on cannabis if you want. Thanks. So we've invented the discipline, and now it's I think patient pressure will eventually, I think it has to happen. Particularly if in a couple of years' time Oregon show it's safe as it is, then it might change. But also the company developing Compass Pathways will apply for a license when they finish their phase 3 trials, which will probably take about another 2 years. So if they work, and I can't see how they can't work, if they work in resistant depression, they're going to work in other depression. So I think in a few years there will be enough evidence to justify making it a medicine. And then the question is what class. I mean, frankly, certainly class C would be too high, but it'd probably be class C. Then. Yeah, I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't have hope. I'd just be taking alcohol. Are you there?
Nearly.
No one? Any other questions? Yeah.
Is there any different kinds of effects with drugs like marijuana?
Sure, now.
Yeah, nice trial. There's a nice trial of Sativex in ADHD. Yeah, it didn't help with the attention, but it helped with other aspects, particularly the anxiety. So yeah, I think that's a field that's going to become quite heavily researched in the next decade. And also, of course, there's cannabidiol for epilepsy, which often occurs, particularly in people with autism. So I think there's going to be a lot of there's a lot of interesting opportunities there. Yes.
If we could actually do something even as private citizens, what would your biggest recommendation be? We write angry letters to our MPs.
Join drug science. Yeah, follow drug science. Become a member of drug science. We write to MPs regularly. We campaign. We have working groups from medical cannabis and medical psychedelics. Support us, and we can help. We can then use you to help promote the cause. Just go on the website drugscience.org. And particularly if you're a scientist, I mean, we'd love to have more scientists. Yeah?
Thanks for the talk, Dave. It's really interesting. I was wondering if there is any interest in trying those drugs you were talking about.
I don't know if that's attached.
For what?
Oh, wait.
Yeah, and many of them say it definitely helped their mood and it helped their anxiety. But the ones that you can't diagnose with personality disorder, it's obviously a weak diagnosis because it's self-reported on a questionnaires. They don't seem to do particularly well. At least they don't seem to improve. So I'm cautious about encourage. I mean, I think we would have to research it properly, but then it might just be that taking psilocybin, in a group in the Netherlands isn't as good as having it as part of a therapy. But personality disorder is a challenging. There's an awful lot in people with personality disorder have usually been traumatized, and re-exposure to those trauma memories through psychedelics. You probably need to invest in something afterwards to deal with it. So I'm not sure they're getting optimal treatment, but I'm saying it's not that hopeful at present because self-medication for depression does seem to help. So. It may just be as hard.
You wouldn't believe it, would you, having a PhD and you still can't work a laptop, so very sorry about that. So I'm going to talk to you about some of the medical cannabis work that drug science has been doing, so Project 2021, and then the medical cannabis and long COVID study that I'm helping to coordinate.
It's tapping.
Oh, it's my necklace. Let me take it off. Is that better? Yeah, you can hear. Okay, cool. So where are we now? So medical cannabis is actually legal in the UK, and it has been legal since November 2018. It was the result of some high-profile cases of parents trying to fight for their children with childhood epilepsy. However, you wouldn't believe that it's actually legal. There's still only a handful of prescriptions on the NHS for children with epilepsy. There's several reasons for this. One of them is that only specialist doctors can prescribe medical cannabis and not GPs. So some more reasons why doctors aren't prescribing medical cannabis on the NHS. So they argue that there's not enough UK-based evidence to support the prescription of medical cannabis products in the UK. There's this preference for randomized controlled trials, so that's when you'd have your placebo versus your drug. There's a lack of education and lack of support for doctors to start prescribing medical cannabis. Again, you have to be the specialist, and you can't just be a GP. So, Drug Science launched Project 2021. So Project 2021, for people who don't know, It's the UK's biggest national medical cannabis real-world registry. So that means it's an observational study. It's not a clinical trial. That will be people will sign up to be a part of the registry. They will access a medical cannabis product through clinics, and then we'll collect the data from several different clinics to try and get data from across the UK on different medical cannabis products for different conditions. So it involves people from academia, industry, the clinicians that are prescribing, and of course the patients who are taking the medical cannabis. So this is all in the hope that this will create that UK evidence base that is really needed to be able to justify and provide that support needed to move medical cannabis from currently the private sector, where the massive majority of prescriptions currently are, into the NHS to support NHS prescriptions of medical cannabis for all the different conditions that it can be used to treat. So at the moment, you can join Project 2021 for several different indications. So the ones that are on the slide are the main ones, which is anxiety, pain, MS, PTSD, substance use disorder, Tourette syndrome, adult epilepsy, and adult ADHD, which was also recently added as an indication. So just to give you a bit of an idea on who's currently signing up to be part of Project 2021, you can see that the majority of patients is chronic pain, as well as anxiety. And we haven't got the data yet for ADHD because that was only added recently as an indication for the project. So patients have to choose the clinic themselves. So there's a clinic directory online on the Drug Science website, and the different clinics will have different specialities and different types of products that they're able to prescribe. So a big benefit of Project 2021 was that they were able to cap the prices of the medical cannabis product. So up until March this year, the products have been capped at a monthly price of £150. That would include getting it delivered to you as part of your prescription. And then you'll also have, there was also consultation charges on top of that. So currently, patients are able to be prescribed either flower, which will be vaporized, or an oil product, different benefits to both, and prescribed in different conditions for different symptoms that they use to treat. So the major output of the project is to collect patient data to give that evidence that's needed. So this is done through questionnaires, standardised questionnaires that can collect key information associated with symptoms that the patients are getting medical cannabis prescribed for. So just to give you a bit of a brief cap on a student campaign that was launched by the head of Project 2021 last September, which was targeted at students. So there was a student discount for members of universities or to be able to join, and again they would receive that capped price of £150 per month per product. And again, it gives students who might want to access a prescription the opportunity to also contribute to the evidence that's being collected throughout the project. So, as you can imagine, they didn't receive necessarily the best response when they reached out to pastoral and wellbeing contacts at universities. So instead what they did was they reached out to universities through different societies, so drug science student societies, as well as the Students for Sensible Drug Policy society set up at universities to try and reach out to them. They had a big comms plan, which involved case study videos, social media posts, blog posts, anything just to try and promote the project within universities. Just to give you a bit of an idea of some of the social media campaign that they had out there, there were some posters which were really nice, which they then turned into social media posts to be shared. There we go. so they were animated. And in these are some student patient stories which are available to watch. There's also other patient stories available on the Drug Science website. I'd really recommend listening to Lucy's video, especially if you haven't already, just to see how transformational medical cannabis has been for her. Being able to now attend university is completely transformational. There's also, if I'm remembering right, Tim might have Tourette's, and again, completely transformational receiving medical cannabis. So go onto the Drug Science website, watch different patient stories, not just the student patient stories, just to kind of give you that patient perspective that I think is really needed with medical cannabis. So they produced a leaflet for students and young people just to try and address the stigma, to really break down the myths from the facts, to try and get out as much evidence-based information as possible to students. And again, an educational flyer, just to kind of really explain the project, really explain how a registry works in terms of collecting data and the involvement in terms of finding your clinic and getting a prescription. They then had more promotional material alongside the social media posts with stickers and badges. And so some nice pictures from Freshers Weeks, just to see people across the UK with drug science student societies, how they try to get involved. So how can you help with Project 2021? So all of these resources are online. So it'd be great for you to share them within your student societies that you might be in. Again, share posts on social media, talk about the science, talk about the truth behind medical cannabis, and again, like Dave said, access educational modules on the Drug Science website. They're really good. I think the medical cannabis ones might be getting updated soon, so again, always go back because they will be getting updated from time to time. And tell your doctor about Project 2021. Make people aware that medical cannabis is actually legal. Sometimes people are shocked when they find out. And really just hear the patient stories as much as possible, and follow different organisations on Twitter about some of the campaigns led by parents on behalf of their children, just to give you some indication of how hard it is to get a prescription and what people are going through. So that's Mags's contact details. She's head of Project 2021. Feel free to reach out to her if you have any questions, and she'll be really happy to help. So what's next for drug science in the world of medical cannabis? So we've just received, in December, we received approval from the MHRA to launch our feasibility study, looking at a CBD-dominant medical cannabis product in the treatment of symptoms associated with long COVID. So I'm working on this study alongside Elizabeth Iverson, who's the principal investigator and the prescribing doctor for the study. And then we have Carol Prosser, who's a research nurse, and then Michael, Anna, and David. So for those of you who don't know, what is long COVID? So long COVID is now also defined as post-COVID-19 syndrome by WHO. So it normally occurs after an acute infection of COVID-19, and it normally will have to last at least 3 months from that onset. So according to the Office of National Statistics, there's an estimated number of 1.3 million people now in the UK living with self-reported long COVID. So the NHS has, or they were, implementing these enhanced long COVID service clinics to try and help support people with long COVID. However, there's a huge unmet need. So the NHS are releasing figures about how many people have managed to be signed up. And as you can see, if there's 1.3 million people reported living with long COVID, and there's only about 5,000 people being signed up, there's going to be a huge backlog of people with this long chronic illness. So it's a really complicated multi-system disease. It's still emerging in the population. COVID hasn't gone. The symptoms really vary from patient to patient. In the symptoms that they have, but also the severity. The most common ones are fatigue, shortness of breath, cognitive dysfunction, often called brain fog. You've probably seen it described in the media. This general impact on your everyday functioning, being so tired that you can't perform your everyday tasks. Pain, mood disturbances such as anxiety and depression, real sleep disturbances, and this emerging understanding of dysautonomia, so that's your dysregulation of your autonomic nervous system. You could be sat down in a chair, you stand up, and your heart rate raises really rapidly, and it doesn't come back down naturally. So there's a real lack of knowledge of treatment approaches. So there's this real urgent need to identify and trial potential treatments quickly to try and help as many people as possible suffering with it. So why use medical cannabis? So medical cannabis is typically prescribed at the moment to treat symptoms, to try and improve the quality of life of a patient. It's already prescribed in several chronic diagnoses such as MS, fibromyalgia, and inflammatory arthritis. So some of these symptoms that medical cannabis is already prescribed for, such as pain, fatigue, anxiety, and mood disorders, are already, the common symptoms of long COVID are already being prescribed for by medical cannabis. So what's the evidence currently that might provide some rationale for using medical cannabis to treat long COVID symptoms? So the evidence in literature, there's already supporting a role in the pain, the fatigue, mood disturbances, and generally improving quality of life of patients. So there's real-world evidence, such as the evidence coming out now from Drug Sciences Registry from Project 2021, particularly looking at the role of medical cannabis in pain, but also now anxiety, depression, and several other disorders. So we're also particularly interested in antidepressant effects and the anti-anxiety effects of CBD, as well as the anti-inflammatory properties and how these might play out in the context of long COVID. And again, as I was mentioning earlier, this autonomia is becoming a big hypothesis now for long COVID. And interestingly, several of the conditions that medical cannabis is prescribed for already, including post-viral conditions, MS, Parkinson's, this autonomia is thought to play an integral role in those conditions, providing support that medical cannabis could also potentially be beneficial in long COVID. So all of this provided the evidence base to support a feasibility study looking into medical cannabis for treatment of long COVID. So just to give you an overview of the study design, so it's a feasibility study. It's open label, so everyone will receive the medical cannabis product. We're recruiting 30 participants. So it's Medicabilis Cannabis Sativa 50, which is a full-spectrum CBD-dominant plant-based medicinal cannabis. So that means it contains mostly CBD, but there is also still some THC in the product. So the study is going to last for 24 weeks in total. There will be a 2-week titration period at the beginning to slowly increase the dose of the product. Then there will be 18 weeks on the steady dose, followed by a 1-week reduction of the dose, and in 3 weeks receiving no medication. So for the total dose each day, initially it'll be up to 2 mils, which will give 100 mg of CBD and 4 mg of THC. However, on clinical judgment, so that'll be on Lsd's and the research nurse, this could be titrated up to a further increase to total 3 mils per day. So because it's a feasibility study, the primary outcomes are going to be recruitment, how easy it is for us to recruit 30 participants, which so far we don't think it'll be hard, but we're actually going through more of a directed approach, working closely with a GP network in Sheffield. Retention, how many of those people that we recruit stay on the study for the full 24 weeks, as well as the number of side effects. that we will record throughout the study. All of our secondary outcomes are more focused on the symptoms associated with long COVID. So we're going to be recording these using a smartphone app developed by Ultraflora, and this will be standardised questionnaires looking across various symptoms, including long COVID symptoms, through a questionnaire that's been developed specifically for long COVID, fatigue, quality of life, pain, mood, sleep. And then we'll be using a Fitbit that will be worn daily to record heart rate, activity levels, including steps, and also oxygen saturation. Daily symptoms will then be measured as well via the app for a discrete period of 7 days for 28 days. So just to give you a little bit more of a detailed look at how the study will take place. So just to remind you, we'll have the clinical assessments at baseline and in every 4 weeks. Then there will be the titration period that I mentioned earlier for the medical cannabis product, then the steady dose, and then the withdrawal, and in the period with no medication, just to make sure that the patients can be observed with taking no medication, and in the Fitbit worn for the full duration of the study. And then you can see here where the app will have the monthly questionnaires, and then the daily symptom trackers for 7 days per 28 days. So it's quite heavy on the clinical assessments. That's just to make sure that we are providing as much safety as possible throughout the whole study. So that's an overview. You can find out some more about the study there's been some press releases online if you're interested, and we're starting to recruit now, which means that hopefully in just over 6 months' time we would have hopefully recruited and finished the study, and we'll be writing up and sharing the results. How can everyone in the audience get involved as students? There's not actually a Bath Drug Science Student Society at the moment, so if anyone would like to set one up, there's the email address. I know there's one in Bath, and there's one in Bristol, and there's one in Cardiff. They're a great way to get involved. Access all the educational resources online, all the slide sets, all the drug information pages, all the videos. There's so much content on the Drug Science website, so definitely use it. Listen to the podcasts with David Nutt. There's some amazing guests on there, and I don't think they always get plugged enough. They're really great to listen to. And one other thing you can join, which is online, it's a really accessible student conference. When you're an undergraduate student or a master's, it's quite hard to attend conferences if you don't know how to. This is an online one. Last year was really great. So if you go onto the Drug Science website under the events section, you'll be able to find the conference, and you can buy heavily reduced ticket prices for students.
Actually, it's the world's cheapest conference.
Yeah,
it's only £5 for a weekend.
And last year was really great, really, really good speakers. So I would really recommend it. Attending conferences like early on in your degree is a great thing to do. So definitely try and attend it if you can. And there's my contact details. Feel free to reach out to me with any questions. But happy to take any questions now about the study, the long COVID study, as well as Project 2021, or more general questions about how you can get involved. Are there any questions to start?
I've got one.
Yeah?
I just wanted to ask about, it seems quite expensive, medical cannabis. What is it that makes it so expensive?
Oh God, this is something we talked about. Essentially, it's a weed. So people say, why is it so expensive?
Well, it's called GMP.
Yeah.
They're all made to GMP spec. They're all imported. We're not allowed to, for some reason, grow it here yet. So those are the two factors. Those are the two main factors.
And do people have to pay for long COVID?
No, so because it's a clinical trial, they don't have to pay. The product will be provided for the whole duration. It's just a standard clinical trial practice.
Yeah, excited about part of the reason why medical
good cost. I mean, RCT, that would cost $500,000. We don't have $500,000. We got 80,000. You can do it for 80,000. That's just the harsh reality of life. And if it's a feasibility study, if it shows something interesting and it gives us a sense of the effect size, we can then hopefully there'll be a lot of companies clamoring to do a full one.
I just had a question about dosage. So with the 2 or 4 milligrams of THC, is that enough for some sort of psychoactive dose? And if so, what time of day are people taking it? And sort of how do they plan their day?
So they'll be taking a morning dose between specific hours, 7 to 9 a.m., I think I'm remembering right, and then an afternoon dose as well. The THC shouldn't induce any psychoactive properties at that low level. That's what the prescribing doctor believes as well. However, it will be titrated up slowly over the 2 weeks to try and minimise any potential effects associated with taking a new medical product. So no, they shouldn't feel any psychoactive properties of THC.
It's possible some will. I mean, we'll monitor that, but there are some people who are very sensitive. But yeah, probably not.
And that was something that was raised as well in getting the MHRA approval, was they were really, there's not many medical cannabis, in fact, so limited medical cannabis studies really in the UK. So trying to get through MHRA, constant questions obviously about the product and its kind of components.
So the comparison is with Sativex, but Sativex has got almost no cannabidiol. The huge amount of cannabidiol here would probably offset, even because 4 milligrams is a Sativex dose, but we think it'll be offset by the cannabidiol. So, but we can't be sure. So we will obviously warn people about that and monitor.
Is this could this be a bit of a belief changer for people? Because instead of going head to head against all of those entrenched views, you give people a fantastic reason to fall in love with it, and then they can loosen those old beliefs.
Yeah, we see this, yes. COVID, one of the very few opportunities that COVID is offering us. Because, long COVID is an enormous problem, and if we can moderate it at all, that's great. So, yeah, I think it's likely to be, given that there are no treatments, it's not as if you're head-to-head with anything. There are no treatments for long COVID. We need them, so at least we're doing our bit. And if it works, well, that might well be, as you say, it might unlock the door to people's rationality about medical cannabis. Yeah.
I think it's people seeing case stories of people with long COVID, just realising how debilitating it is for people. I think that will help kind of reduce the stigma, not only for long COVID, but other post-viral conditions, which people have often disbelieved. So potentially, this could be quite a...
We're not going to do an ME study, though. I've done those. They're difficult and completely unrewarding. There's some questions out here.
So you mentioned that there's really no prescribing rates of it. Do you think that current drug companies produce things like opioids or gabapentinoids have any influence on that?
Well, I'd be surprised if those companies they're certainly not coming out saying it's bad. I think the opioid companies are dangerous. They're tucked right back in their shells now, aren't they? They're not going to be doing anything to sort of bring attacks into them. Pfizer, I guess, are they actually still making money out of gabapentinoids? Probably a bit. I think again they would be it would be bad press for them to become publicly hostile to innovation. But behind the scenes, there's no question that behind the scenes, I get abused on Twitter by doctors all the time saying that question you just raised. Why it's pointless to do a non-controlled trial. Well, it's not ideal, but it's better than doing nothing. So I suspect behind the scenes there's quite a lot of resistance to accepting what we call real-world evidence rather than controlled trials, because you have to, the reality is you have to be a mega company to do an RCT. You look at medical cannabis, you look at GW Pharma, they've been going for 30 years. They've managed to raise enough money to do 4 trials effectively. 2 trials in childhood epilepsy, 1 in tuberous sclerosis, and another one in adult epilepsy, which failed. And it's cost them tens of millions of pounds. And in every case, I think to start with, the MHRA turned them down anyway. There's not a lot of incentive for people to get into this space, and certainly it's it would be it's what I find really. I don't know if any of you read I wrote a critique of medicine and cannabis in the BMJ last week. The idea that we have to wait as doctors until a company decides it's profitable enough to do a trial in a study in a disorder like Ehlers-Danlos, like Lucy. There's never been a treatment of Ehlers-Danlos. Why should we have to wait for that to happen, even knowing it probably won't? And that's just the wrong approach. We ought to be at least, trying things out and getting knowledge rather than necessarily getting a license to use the medication. That's better than nothing, I think.
With medical cannabis, is there a lot of interpatient variability, and
Yeah.
are there any patient factors that may change how people respond?
Well, there's a lot of interpatient variability in everything, absolutely. But so little is known about that. Because cannabis is late coming to this. Are there any genes that might predict responses? Possibly, but I don't think nothing convincingly demonstrated. Obviously there's a lot of interest around the FAR gene, the fatty acid amide hydrolysis gene, which supposedly mutations of that change the level of endogenous cannabinoids, and some suggesting that may be relevant to some syndromes. If you heard of the Scottish woman who didn't have pain, you ever heard about a couple of years ago, the Scottish woman became quite famous because she didn't have pain. And she didn't have pain in childbirth, she didn't have headaches and that. And they discovered she had a mutation of the FAR gene, which was inactive, so she wasn't metabolizing anandamide or the endogenous cannabinoids. So there will be some people like that, and there's bound to be mutations of the cannabis receptor. But they're not really translated into any kind of clinically useful things. And even if they do, the NHS won't care, because we've been able to do useful analysis of all sorts of metabolic proteins like cytochrome for 20 years, and we've just never bothered because it's too difficult for doctors to do. They can't get their head around it.
Slightly similar, but are you excluding people that take certain medication or contraceptives from the study, just in case that interferes?
So we're not, but the rule is that if you're of childbearing potential, so essentially both male and female, you have to agree to be on a highly effective form of contraception from the moment of signing consent until, I think it's 4 weeks or 12 weeks after the study. So there's specific guidance that the MHRA wanted us to follow, similar to Sativex. So you just have to agree to use a reliable form of contraception for the study.
That's ultra cautious.
Yeah. That's
ultra, because there's no evidence that either THC or cannabidiol affects the availability of oral contraceptives. But some of you may have heard what our Chief Medical Officer said to the government's Health Select Committee last year on medical cannabis. We don't want another thalidomide. And I thought, if that guy's running COVID in this country, he doesn't understand that, millions of women have taken cannabis for millions of years, probably. And there's never been an example of phocomelia like that. So the hysteria in the medical profession about cannabis, it's belts and braces, really. So I don't think there's any risk at all either way, but we just don't want to be caught, people saying, you haven't done it, therefore we're not going to let you do it. Well, I think if you're a Bath undergraduate with rich parents, yeah, that's not most. Is that not right? Is that what you told me? It's a lot. 50 milligrams is quite expensive. Do you know that? You may not know that. Maybe you may not realise how expensive cannabidiol is if you buy it over the counter. So, 50 milligrams is going to cost you, what, it's £10 a day probably. Yeah, but you could. Yeah, absolutely. I wouldn't stop you doing it. If you do, then just let us know if it works. No, seriously. No, I'm being deadly serious here. Actually, one of the things we are discussing is doing citizen science. We're seeing if we can set up a trial of people who use CBD And some of you may have seen the paper we published last year in eLife on citizen science of microdosing. Did any of you see that? So you can't study microdosing of psychedelics because they're all illegal drugs. It's just impossible. So what we did was a guy in our group called Balash worked out a way of allowing you to blind yourself at home. So you blinded yourself to whether you thought you were using psychedelic or not. And it worked brilliantly. Yeah, the blinding was very effective, and unfortunately the microdosing didn't really do very much. But the methodology is established for doing that kind of blinding in people's homes. So we're talking with a cannabis company about trying to do that. Yeah. So, and that would be fantastic because you could. We got, I think, 300 or 400 people internationally to do the microdosing study. We could potentially get a lot more doing a CBD study. So follow me on Twitter, and when it's ready, I'll let you know, right? But you'll have to pay for your own. So.
So I just want to get back to the RCTs. I know they're expensive, but pharma have a lot of money, right? Why don't you do that?
Why are pharma in this space?
So it's because it's going to be an oversaturated market. So I think that's going to be they're not going to be able to patent it.
That's the problem.
So it all comes down to patents, and if the money's not going to be there, they're not going to invest all that money.
So I'm going to say this to you guys. I'm conscious there may be people in the audience more expert than me, but I do not believe that the MHRA or its predecessors have ever licensed in Britain a herbal plant-based extract medicine. And I was on the CSM when Hypericum, St. John's wort, came through. Very nice controlled trials, perfect from Germany, perfectly effective drug. I voted that it should be made a medicine here because the evidence was good. It was as good as meclobamide, a weak monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And I'm not sure I'm going to say the pharmacists in the group, but there were two people on the committee who were interested in specification, and they specified that the variation of active ingredient had to be with like plus or minus 2%, which is impossible to get with a plant. So it was banned. And now in Germany, I think they've got 20 different herbal medicines. And and the Germans aren't sort of dying, are they? And they're probably doing quite well in terms of medical. They've certainly got much lower levels of excess deaths from COVID than we have. So you think, well, it's good enough for the Germans, but it's not good enough for us because we've set ourselves a peculiarly high threshold for accepting any evidence in this country.
So is that why CBD flower is illegal because it's a full plant-based, or is it legal? I'm not sure.
I don't think CBD flower is illegal, but you cannot get CBD flower probably without any THC. So this gets into the whole issue of hemp. So if you grow CBD with hemp, there's THC present, and that's why they destroyed whole hemp fields in Britain last year or the year before, because of the possibility. See, the Home Office think like this. You could take a litre of CBD oil and get stoned. You'd vomit, you'd die before you got stoned. But the danger of you getting stoned on that little bit of THC, whoa, we can't have you breaking the law. There's an absurdity to it. So that is one of the reasons why, although cannabidiol was legal since it's always been legal, it wasn't controlled from 1971. People have not gone down that route because they've never been confident enough they could get rid of the THC, and it isn't easy to get rid of the THC. So it will be controlled under THC, not under cannabidiol.
So you talked about studies into psilocybin and LSD, but have there been any studies done on the uses of stronger psychedelics such as DMT or Salvia?
So, are you a pharmacology student?
No.
It shows. There's no such thing as stronger. Stronger is not a scientific term. But you mean either more potent or faster acting or... Yeah. Well, of course, DMT is less potent as well. But so let me not embarrass your lack of pharmacology. But have there been studies done on alternatives forms? So DMT seems stronger if you use it because you smoke it and it gets in faster. But when DMT is used as ayahuasca, which is a drink, they give it to kids in the Santa Diami Church. So So it's not stronger if, it depends how much you take. But yeah, there are studies going. We've done studies on DMT. We've shown it produces the same effect in the brain as LSD and psilocybin. We're now doing a trial of slow infusion of DMT over about 30 minutes to see if we can produce an effect which is tolerable, but which potentially would allow people to engage in psychotherapy. So there are trials. So that's for depression. There's also 5-methoxy-DMT, which we are exploring with a company either as a nasal spray, which is kind of how it's snorted often in Mexico, or as a disposable film. So those studies are ongoing. Yeah, Salvia. I don't think Salvia is going to go anywhere. Salvia is a kappa agonist. It produces a very unpleasant trip, somewhat similar in terms of the neuroscience to psychedelics, but probably sufficiently aversive that it's unlikely to be used in people. And we can talk more about that at some point, but kappa agonists have got a very, very poor track record of turning into medicines. Yeah.
Just on that point about 5-MeO-DMT and regular DMT, is there any difference in therapeutic potential there?
Well, only if you think that a sudden short shock is going to sort of. I mean, you can have a 3-minute 5-methoxy trip. Is that going to cure your depression? Well, some people think it might. So, it's all about the kinetics. It might not. I mean, there are whole books written on how the toad cured my life. But in fact, when you read the books, you discover they kept getting ill again. So, I don't. The answer is time will tell. Maybe a short shot hit all good. Maybe it won't. Maybe different people benefit from different ones. Yeah, I don't know. We use psilocybin because it's a 4 to 5 hour trip when you take it orally. That means you can do it. You don't have to keep people in overnight. We don't use LSD because they'd have to be in overnight. And it's mild, it's gentle. People don't usually have bad trips. DMT is what you were thinking, I think, with it. DMT and 5-methoxy can produce extraordinary, interesting experiences that some people like and some people find very aversive. So that it's kind of going to be harder to sort of walk the tightrope between good and bad, heaven and hell, So I don't know whether DMT is going to work or not. But it certainly perturbs the brain pretty powerfully.
Okay, I think we're done. We'll be out for in a few minutes.
All right, good.